I can still clearly remember that terrible weekend. It's a terrifying story that still lingers in my mind. I was a world traveler who has traveled far and wide, depending on Airbnb for comfortable and distinctive lodging all around the world. I had no idea that my next stop would lead to an encounter that would permanently alter the way I perceived short-term rentals. It all started when I came across a seductive listing for an Airbnb home in a secluded, charming community tucked away in the Appalachian Mountains. The images showed a lovely cabin nestled in thick forest, overlooking a calm lake. Reviews praised the friendly host Sarah, and the pricing was incredibly reasonable for such a beautiful location. I quickly reserved my accommodation because I was eager for a weekend respite from the stress of everyday life. The trip to the cottage was difficult and long, with twisting paths that seemed to take one farther and more into the forest. My GPS signal started to weaken, so I had to rely on sporadic mobile coverage for navigation. I could feel my sensation of loneliness building as the sun sank below the horizon, but I dismissed such feelings as a product of my hyperactive imagination. Rustic appeal that seemed to embrace me. As soon as I got out of my car, it was much more gorgeous in person than it appeared in the pictures. I could hear the gentle sound of the ocean lapping against the coast and the distant rustle of foliage. I was struck by the serene beauty all around me, as well as the aroma of damp ground and pine. The interior of the cabin was equally charming, featuring a well-equipped kitchen, a nice living area with a roaring fireplace, and a bedroom with an amazing view of the lake. The ideal location for a tranquil getaway. My host Sarah left me a warm and friendly welcome note, confirming that I had made the right decision. Once darkness fell, I decided to explore the adjacent forests, drawn by the charm of nature in its purest form. With a flashlight in hand, I made my way into the quiet, dark forest. I had not gone far into the woods when I heard the slightest of whispers, sounds that were barely audible to me. Initially, I wrote them off as the sound of leaves rustling in the wind, but the recurring whispers made me shiver. I cautiously pursued the sound farther into the forest, and before long I came to a small, dilapidated building that was hardly visible in the poor light. The windows were broken, and the wooden walls of the deserted cabin groaned with age. The murmurs became clearer and louder, and I started to feel afraid. It was as though the walls themselves contained the secrets of the people who had lived there, even though no one was present. I was determined not to think about the unsettling experience as I made my way back to the security of my rented cabin. Since I was in the middle of nowhere, maybe other hikers had ventured nearer, and that's how the ghostly voices appeared. I could not have made a worse mistake. I heard it that night while I laid in bed and listened to the eerie sounds coming from the far-off forest. The murmurs had trailed me. The cabin was where they were. I started to get panicky as I struggled to understand what I was saying. The voices appeared to be those of several different people. They were nervous in tone and had hazy words. I took hold of my flashlight and thoroughly examined the cabin, but no one was present. Even when I went outside and shone my light into the night, I discovered that the woods were deserted. My breathing was labored and my heart was racing. The quiet of the woods must have allowed my imagination to go wild, and I knew I had to be hallucinating. I couldn't sleep that night. The murmurs persisted, steadily penetrating my mind. As dawn broke, I made the decision to look into it more. My first stop was the abandoned cabin where the whispers had come from. I could not get rid of the unsettling feeling that someone was watching me when I arrived at the rundown building. The broken windows of the decaying cabin stared at me like empty eye sockets. There was a strange silence in place of the whispers. I inhaled deeply and went inside, where my flashlight revealed a room full of mildewed draperies and decomposing furniture. It was a desolate, lonely spot, long since abandoned. But when I looked around more, I discovered a secret room under a floorboard. I pried it open with shaky hands, and within were several old yellowed notes with fine calligraphy and faded ink. The recipient of the letters was identified as Sarah. When I saw that they were letters from the early 1900s, my heart fell. The letters described the story of Sarah, a woman who had lived in the exact cabin I was staying in over a century earlier. For reasons that were unclear, she had been a loner and avoided by the hamlet. The message's words expressed hopelessness, loneliness, and a crippling sense of isolation. The only thing that had been with Sarah had been the murmurs, an enigmatic presence that seemed to haunt her. As I realized the terrifying connection, my brain whirled. The same whispers that had troubled Sarah had also haunted me, reverberating through the ages. I felt a shiver run down my spine, thinking that her terrible, tormented spirit might still be there in the cottage I was now calling home. I chose to confront my host, Sarah, whose name was still unknown, since I was desperate for answers. When I got back to my cabin, she wasn't there. I tried to message and phone her, but she didn't pick up. She seemed to have disappeared, leaving me by myself in this unsettling location. I realized with a sinking sense that I had to go. After hurriedly packing my luggage, I tried to start my car, but it would not start. The engine had run flawlessly the day before, but now it sputtered and died. When panic struck, I realized I had no way out of this isolated place where I was stuck. I made the decision to stay in my cabin as night fell in the hopes of solving my problem first thing the next day. I examined all the windows and doors again, telling myself that my worry was unfounded and that I was safe. But just as I was ready to go to sleep, the voices came back, louder and more persistent than before. I lay there, terrified to the point of paralysis, as voices surrounding me, speaking incomprehensibly yet anguish-filled. The cabin made a sound like it was alive, groaning and creaking in response to these invisible beings. I pulled the blankets over my head in an attempt to drown out the sound, but the whispering continued, getting louder and more frantic. The room went dark in the middle of this ghostly assault. I was in total darkness because my flashlight had died. I reached for my phone, the lone source of light, with shaky hands. Something shivered me to the core as its radiance peeked through the shadows. At the foot of my bed stood a dark form that gave the impression of shifting and writhing. There were no features to be seen, no face, just a shape that radiated evil. My heart was racing in my chest, and I was so afraid that I was unable to scream. As the ghostly figure approached, I could feel its suffocating presence, as if it were squeezing the life out of my lungs. The noises became more and more frantic, like the thing whispering to the others. I was a prisoner in a world of fear that defied logic, imprisoned in a nightmare. I got out of bed and ran toward the door, with a sudden bravery, determined to get out of the cabin. However, the apparition moved in front of me as I approached the entrance, preventing me from leaving. It seemed to be playing tricks on me, as though it knew exactly where I would go. I swung around as I felt a clammy, icy touch on my shoulder and saw the figure just inches from my face. It was oppressive, and all I could see in its shapeless emptiness was darkness. I opened my mouth to scream, but nothing came out, and quiet and darkness descended upon the room in an instant. I shivered in the pitch-black darkness, alone since the figure had vanished. When morning finally arrived, I was filled with a deep sense of dread. The whispering had stopped, the suffocating presence that had plagued me the previous night had lifted, and the cabin was silent. I wasn't sure if I had had a true otherworldly encounter or just a bad nightmare, so I was feeling both relieved and confused. When I finally made a move to drive away, I was shocked that my car started right away. I couldn't get rid of the impression that someone was watching me, and that eyes were following me everywhere as I drove away from the cabin. When I went back to the village to ask questions about the enigmatic cabin, the people there said they had no knowledge of it. It appeared as though the cabin's tragic past had vanished from the village's common memory. I'm still plagued by what happened that evening. The figure, the voices, and the mysterious darkness that surrounded me are all beyond explanation. The abandoned cabin and the writings describing a troubled soul named Sarah are beyond me to explain. I had no idea why my host vanished into thin air or why my automobile wouldn't start. My terrifying and enigmatic stay in that isolated cabin in the Appalachian Mountains will always be associated with a gloomy period of my life. By telling this terrifying story, I can only hope that others will be alerted to the potential hidden horrors that can exist within the walls of ostensibly benign Airbnb properties, and that they will proceed with caution and vigilance on their own travels. It all started one gloomy, rainy evening when I was sitting in front of my computer, looking through Airbnb listings to find my next travel destination. I like to travel and was constantly looking for interesting and reasonably priced places to stay. I had no idea that the rental I was going to reserve would result in a horrifying encounter that would permanently alter my perception of short-term lodging. This is the account of my terrifying stay at the Airbnb that is not allowed. There was nothing like the listing that drew my attention. It offered a charming, historically significant mansion in the center of the city. The pictures showed off a stately, ivy-covered building with tall spires, elaborate construction, and a Gothic elegance for such a unique property. The pricing was shockingly low, and the few reviews that were available were very positive about the host, an enigmatic character only known as Mr. Blackwood. I made my reservation because I was intrigued and attracted by the idea of staying in a home with a fascinating past. I could feel the excitement building as I got closer to the city on the day of my arrival. The ominous clouds above appeared to reflect the gloomy environment I was going to enter. The estate was surrounded by wrought iron gates and a creepy mist, and it was located on a quiet street. I felt a chill go down my spine because of the atmosphere, which was thick with secrets and history. My enigmatic host, Mr. Blackwood, gave me a polite nod and a tight-lipped smile as he ushered me inside. His clothes were sober, his eyes were pale, and carried a depth that was impossible to decipher. He was a guy of few words. The mansion's interior was a blend of ageless grandeur and faded opulence, with dimly lighted passageways that screamed of bygone eras, heavy drapes and ancient furnishings. With a canopy bed, elaborate decor, and a huge, elaborate mirror that appeared to carry the secrets of 1,000 previous visitors, my room was just as magnificent as the rest of the mansion. I felt like an intruder in a place that should have stayed unaltered by time as the weight of history pressed down on me. The creaking of the old home and the distant sounds made for an unsettling symphony that night as I slept in the big bed. I tried to find comfort in my dreams, but the cold of the mansion was eating into my bones. Mr. Blackwood told me the next day about a tour he gave to the select few visitors who ventured to reserve his mansion. I was excited to join the tour, since it promised to reveal the house's hidden history. The tour started in the dark basement, where Mr. Blackwood told stories of how the mansion had once housed the destitute during the Great Depression. The stories were bleak, and the damp, chilly air felt heavy with the agony of those who had come here for safety. It got much more oppressive as we ascended the huge staircase to the upper floors. Mr. Blackwood told tales of unexplained disappearances and odd murders that had happened inside the estate. He talked about the notorious murder-suicide that happened in one of the chambers, the specifics of which were never made public. The trip finished in the attic, which Mr. Blackwood said was off-limits to visitors because of its troubled past. He described a number of occult rites carried out by the mansion's previous owner, who was well known for his paranormal obsessions. He believed that there were ancient relics and secret knowledge hidden in the attic that should never be discovered. His stories weighed heavily on me as I made my way down from the attic, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had wandered into a place best left forgotten. I missed the cozy confines of my chamber, far from the scary stories and the mysterious Mr. Blackwood. I couldn't get rid of the impression that someone was watching me that night as I laid in bed. Even though the room was completely dark, I could still feel someone there. To my dismay, when I strained my ears, I heard what sounded like far-off voices drifting on the wind, faint whispers. The voices became clearer, and their tone more nervous and irritated as I listened closer. It appeared as though they were engaged in a contentious debate right outside the walls. Snatches of words and phrases were visible to me, but they were meaningless, and my terror only became stronger. I grabbed the old mirror and looked around the room via its reflection. I could see faint, shifting figures like specters moving in the dark as I gazed into the depths of the mirror, where the voices appeared to be coming from. My heart was pounding, and I was starting to feel anxious. I went to the mirror in a state of desperation, whispering, "Who are you? What are your desires?" The voices persisted and got louder, but I was unable to understand what they were saying. I turned away from the mirror and headed toward the door, intending to confront Mr. Blackwood because I could take no more of his unsettling presence. However, I felt a sinking sensation when I grabbed for the doorknob and discovered it was locked from the outside. I had no way out of the room where I was stuck. I banged on the door and yelled for assistance, but nobody answered. The voices in the mirror became more desperate and louder, like they were trying to say something. A sense of helplessness overcame me, as though I were trapped in a nightmare with no way out. The voices persisted for hours without showing any signs of stopping. My sanity was beginning to fade, and I pondered if the home contained any sinister secrets or prohibited knowledge. The conversations finally stopped as the first rays of morning emerged, leaving the room silent. The mirror, which had formerly terrified people, was now motionless, its depth serene and empty. I walked up to the mirror, my hands shaking, and touched it, half expecting it to reveal some secret. However, the mirror did not speak, and I was unable to perceive anything in its depths. It felt as though the entity that had been haunting me had disappeared into the night. I was finally able to leave the room when the morning sun came up, but I couldn't shake my uneasiness. I went looking for Mr. Blackwood, but he was not there. It appeared as though he had vanished, leaving the home to myself. Eager to move past the terrifying experience, I made the decision to depart from the estate as soon as possible. However, what greeted me as I approached the front door was a terrifying sight. The opulent front door of the home had disappeared, to be replaced by a sturdy brick-and-mortar wall. I was stranded within the mansion with nowhere to go. It was as though the door had never been. I started to panic, thinking there must be another way out. But the mansion appeared to have changed into a maze of closed doors and never-ending halls. I had a crushing sense of dread, as if the walls themselves were closing in on me. I discovered a room that I had never seen before as I kept exploring the mansion. I discovered antiquated literature and artifacts pertaining to the paranormal and occult inside. It was the same room, the forbidden attic that contained information forbidden that Mr. Blackwood had forewarned me about. There was a heavy aura in the room, and I could sense something sinister coming from the items. Though the mansion's twisting hallways and closed doors seemed to be working against me, I knew I had to find a way out. Nights grew to days as I was confined to the mansion and plagued by thoughts of being observed and voices in the mirror. The voices seemed to be getting closer to me as I could hear them, becoming louder and more forceful. I was aware that I needed to discover the truth about the mansion's sinister past in order to find a route out. I was getting more and more desperate every day. I searched every inch of the estate, looking for hidden passageways or hints, but the walls looked unbreakable. I was still being tormented by the voices in the mirror, their words a ceaseless, excruciating chorus. Then, one evening, as I stood in front of the mirror, I had an epiphany. The sounds were coming from somewhere outside the mirror, not from inside it. Like me, they were stuck and were attempting to express how much they needed to be freed. I reached out to the mirror and murmured, "How can I help you?" with newfound resolve. The words were eventually understandable as the voices became clearer. They talked about a curse that kept them confined to the estate, and that could only be lifted with the offer of a willing sacrifice. And I considered the consequences of what they had said. I was overcome with dread. I was the unintentional sacrifice that the house demanded. I had to give myself up as the sacrifice in order to get out of the mansion and release the captive spirits. I made my choice with heavy heart. In an attempt to break the curse and release the imprisoned spirits, I would face the curse head-on and give myself as the willing sacrifice. And the voices in the depths appeared to grow quieter as I stood in front of the mirror, as if they realized what I was trying to say. I took a deep breath and murmured the words of sacrifice, and the surface of the mirror shimmered and rippled. The mirror broke in an instant, and a blast of icy air shot through the room. The sounds were becoming quieter and farther away, and I could hear them disappearing into the distance. A mansion appeared to let go of me, and I suddenly found myself at the front door, the mansion's entry having taken the place of the solid wall made of brick and mortar. I was relieved to get outside and leave the mansion and its troubled past behind. The world outside appeared to have come back to life, and the rain had stopped. Even though I had made it through the forbidden Airbnb, I would never be able to shake the horrible recollections of my stay. Mr. Blackwood vanished from my life, and the mansion vanished from the Airbnb listings as well, leaving no trace of its existence. I still don't know how to explain the paranormal powers that imprisoned me inside its walls or the occult mirror that exposed the truth about its troubled past. My terrifying experience serves as a terrifying reminder of the potential hazards that can be found even in the seemingly typical lodging options we select for our trips. By telling people about my experience, I can only hope that they will approach their own Airbnb stays with caution and awareness, and be cautious of the secrets that might be lurking in the shadows of a long forbidden past. On a chilly winter's evening, my curiosity guided me along a route I would later come to regret. I had come to rely on Airbnb as a frequent visitor for distinctive, reasonably priced lodging all around the world, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened to me that fateful weekend. A terrifying experience. This is the account of my horrible experience with Airbnb. an encounter that still gives me chills. The listing that drew my attention offered a warm, secluded cottage in Wisconsin's northern woods, the ideal escape from the bustle of the big metropolis. The images showed a charming cabin covered in a thick coating of snow and tucked away in a deep woodland surrounded by tall pine trees. The host, a woman named Karen, was highly praised in the reviews, and the cost was unexpectedly affordable. I excitedly made my reservation because I was much in need of a vacation from the hectic pace of everyday life. I saw the cityscape change to scenes covered in snow as I set out to reach my secluded haven. I felt more alone as my GPS led me farther into the woods and the service grew erratic. Even though my heart was racing, I dismissed my discomfort as the result of an overactive imagination. I reached the cabin after several hours of twisty roads and a snowfall that kept becoming thicker. As nice as the pictures appeared, it greeted me as soon as I got out of my car and had a cozy, rustic charm. Aside from the odd murmur of the wind through the trees and the distant hoot of an owl, everything was dead quiet. My nose were overwhelmed with the aroma of pine and the clean winter air, and I knew I had come to the right place. The cabin's interior had a cozy bedroom overlooking the snowy landscape, a well-stocked kitchen, and a wood-burning fireplace that provided warmth and coziness. I was greeted with a handwritten card from Karen telling me that I had chosen well for my winter getaway. There was calm and quiet on the first night in the cabin. I sipped hot cocoa by the fire, watched the snow fall outside my window, and felt as though the world's weight lifted off my shoulders. It was just what I required. My spirit of adventure took me to explore the snow-covered forest surrounding the chalet the next morning. With my boots making deep tracks in the new snow, I stepped out into the frozen terrain, armed with warm gear and a sense of amazement. I was astounded by the winter wilderness's pure beauty as I ventured farther into the woodland. Everything was silent, as though the cold contained nature's breath. The sky was a clear, beautiful blue, and the white ground was covered in lengthy shadows made by the weak light of the sun. I became aware that I had gone farther than I had planned as the hours passed. The trail I had taken had disappeared under the thick layer of snow, and the forest appeared to go on forever in all directions. I made the decision to go back since I was starting to feel uneasy. I observed something strange as I turned to head back. I noticed some footprints in the snow that weren't mine. There was a hint of worry in me, as they were new and led further into the forest. I had assumed that I would be by myself out here. When with my heart racing, I followed the footprints and soon found myself in a tiny clearing. A circle of old, gnarled trees, their branches intertwined as though in a hushed discussion, stood in the midst of the clearing. There was a towering, dark man in the middle of this unsettling grove. It shivered down my spine as it stood motionless and turned its back on me. "Hello," I hesitantly cried out, but the person didn't move. The unease increased with each step I drew closer, and I could feel the hairs on my neck bristle. My curiosity overrode my instincts, which begged me to turn and flee. I caressed the figure's shoulder with my quivering hand. The image twisted as my fingers touched it, showing a face that seemed at once ancient and worn. Its skin was thin and wrinkled, and its eyes were empty and gloomy. With my heart racing, I staggered backward as the person gazed at me with a menacing intensity. The stranger turned and walked away without saying anything, disappearing into the snow-covered forest. I was left standing in the clearing, terror and anxiety whirling through my head. What had been happening in the woods, and who was this ancient, enigmatic figure? Startled, I swiftly went back where I had been, resolved to forget the experience. I tried to divert my attention with a nice book and a cup of hot tea when I got back to the cabin, but the image of the figure followed me everywhere. I heard an odd sound that night as I laid in bed and listened to the howling wind outside. It sounded like the slow, methodical beat of a drum, a soft, repetitive tapping. I strained to listen closer, but I was unable to identify the source of the sound. As the tapping became more intense, I recognized that it originated from the cabin's walls. It seemed as though someone or something was trying to enter by tapping on the wooden walls outside. I was so terrified that I reached for a flashlight and stepped closer to the window. As the world coated in snow was silent and deserted outside. The tapping had stopped, and no one was present. I looked about for any indications of movement, but I couldn't find any. With my heart racing, I went back to bed and attempted to convince myself that it was just the wind. However, as soon as I shut my eyes, I heard the methodical, slow tapping on the cabin walls once more. I had the impression that someone or something was attempting to speak with me. I cried out, hands trembling, "Who's there? What are your desires?" The eerie silence of the wintry night persisted without a reply. The tapping persisted, becoming more forceful and louder, and was more than I could bear. I needed to find out what was making that noise. I hastily put on my clothes and went outside, my flashlight piercing the obscurity. The tapping felt like it was coming from everywhere, as though there was a dark spirit alive in the forest itself. I noticed something moving in the shadows as I shone my light on the trees. It was the same figure I'd seen earlier that day in the clearing. It had menacing presence and gloomy, hollow eyes. And with fear in my heart, I staggered back. The person approached, moving deliberately and slowly. Now, instead of hearing the tapping on the walls of the cottage, I could hear it on the trees. The figure appeared to be attempting to speak to me or send some sort of message that I was unable to interpret. I turned and rushed back to the cottage, desperate to get away, with the person trailing closely behind. The tapping increased in volume and intensity, and I felt its presence drawing nearer to me. Arriving at the cabin at the perfect moment, I forcefully shut the door and secured it. While tapping within persisted, a constant, annoying noise that reverberated around the cabin. Alone with this evil force that looked intent on getting to me, I was imprisoned. The whole night was a swirl of anxiety and perplexity. The sound of a man tapping on the walls outside seemed to be an attempt to break in. I felt a great sensation of fear, like though some ancient evil force was hunting me. A morning eventually arrived. The tapping stopped. When I gingerly ventured outdoors, the apparition had vanished. I had the unshakable impression that it was still keeping an eye on me and waiting to attack. Fear weighing heavily on my heart, I hastily grabbed my belongings and left the cabin. I kept thinking about the tapping that had been haunting me and the enigmatic person in the woods as I drove away. I went back to the village and asked questions about the cabin and its mysterious owner, Karen. To my surprise, no one in the region seemed to know about the location, and there was no mention of a host named Karen. My cabin and its unsettling past seemed to have vanished from the world, leaving me bereft and filled with a persistent sense of disquiet. I can't get the Airbnb nightmare out of my head. The enigmatic figure and constant tapping are still there, a terrifying reminder of the hidden horrors that can be found in the seemingly perfect properties we pick for our vacations. By sharing my terrifying story, all I can hope is that others would book their own Airbnb stays with caution and keep an eye out for the unexplained and the unexpected that might be waiting for them in the middle of nowhere.